Roldi. I am one of your chair today. I'm sharing the chairing of this session with Jeff Matsu from CIPFA, which is the Chartered Institute for Public Finance and Accountability, and also a GO Lab fellow. Before I welcome everybody and introduce the session, I just want to give some few housekeeping rules. As you might have noticed, the meeting is being recorded, so we can make it available for people who can't join us today, or you can share within your network. And I would advise everybody to keep muted so that there is no disturbance. And please do introduce yourself in the chat, say who you are, where you're calling from, and feel free to post the Q&A question in the chat as we go along. The session will consist in giving space to our speaker, one after the other, and at the end, we will have time for us to discuss what we've heard today. So I'll kick us off. As I said, my name is Maria Roldi. I'm the Academic Director of the Government Outcomes Lab, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this peer learning session on the Value and Public Finance peer learning group. The session today is about a topic that is very dear to us, which is value for money. GO Lab-CIPFA has developed in the past a toolkit to support people doing value for money analysis. And GO Lab looks at outcome-based contracts, and of course, being able to name the outcome and measure the outcome is part of the conversation, and much can be learned from the value for money community. The reason we put together this session and the toolkit is that we feel there is, when we talk to our practitioner, a sort of gap in the space where there is a clear guidance at the level of economic theory on how you should go about measuring value for money. And there are different governments issue some guidelines. For instance, in the UK, we have the Green Book from Treasury on how to do that, and there are principles. But then when you go to practitioner on the ground, there is an appetite for something that is more pragmatic, some example that can be followed. And today we want to open up a discussion with 4 speakers who have plenty of expertise on developing value for money analysis to understand what we already know, how we can do things better, and what we can go to improve how we do value for money. So I am starting as off with one of our speakers, who is Tori Olfin. Tori is works for Solveridden in Cambridge, and she's a data scientist. And one of the projects on which she worked is a project that she did for the Thames Valley Police Violence Reduction Unit, where they try to use data to improve decision making. And so I give the floor to Tori. You have about 10 minutes to talk about your experience and approaches to measuring value for money. And when your time is up, I'll let you know, so we will leave enough time for the Q&A session at the end. Tori, the floor is yours. I think you're still muted, Tori.
Apologies. Hi, so I'm Tori Olfin. I'm Head of Research and Evaluation for Thames Valley Violence Reduction Unit as well, which means that I'm responsible for most of our research projects that we're running. And over my time in working in the public sector, I've been involved in somewhere between 200 and 250 research projects. I've built algorithms in policing, and I've implemented them in randomized controlled trials. And I've seen that there's a lot of common problems with implementing things in relation to what works. So if we can go to the, can I skip forwards, or is that controlled by? So if the work I'm about to present is open under an open government license, and if that could be referenced as such, but it is completely free for anybody to use. We would like it to be used more widely than just ourselves. But so on our sort of problems I've seen as we've gone through is that Police and other public sector agencies, if we can go to the next one, sorry, are often rushed to get things done. They're given very short timelines to get funding bids in. And that often leads to things not being planned properly before they do them. So they're trying to produce good evidence, but it ends up being that they don't plan it up front. They end up asking somebody to evaluate it afterwards. No one really knows what works. They can't put any monetary figures on the findings. And therefore, because they haven't arranged a control group that is like their treatment group, they're not even able to say what the difference was between the ones who received the treatment and the ones that didn't. And therefore, we can't possibly identify what value for money has been reached by doing this outcome. By not identifying the counterfactual, or what would have happened if they didn't have the treatment, we aren't able to show the benefit of what we're doing, or the value therein. And sometimes that even gets a little bit worse, and there were no baseline measurements taken, so they don't work out sometimes how many of their group that they want to treat they would have had last year, and what bad things might have been suffered by those groups last year, and what that might have cost. So all of this goes together to be very, very difficult to show whether something works or not. And if you can't say whether it works or not and what effect it has, you can't possibly identify the value for money that you have in doing it. So if we could go to the next one. Thank you. So it also leads to people and organizations asking for somebody to evaluate something after it's been finished. And I'm sure there are plenty of people in this room that have been asked to do exactly that, and sort of scratch their head as to how to find something that's resilient in what was done. It also doesn't prevent us having interventions that clash and hit each other as we're doing them. So we could be running 3 different trials in custody at the same time, all on different age groups, but one of the trials overlaps the other 2 age groups, meaning that somebody could be randomized into 3 different trials. By controlling them all in a more rigorous way and putting a life cycle around it, we can remove many of these problems, avoiding rushed implementation because we can be ready at the time we get the funding. We can ensure that we have the right amount of resourcing going into it, and we can ensure that we balance the interventions that we have. We can go to the next one. Thank you. So I have a few, and these are just pretty much quotes from me. So I do work for Thames Valley Violence Reduction Unit. However, these are entirely my views that I have imposed on research. They are not the views that Thames Valley Violence Reduction Unit came up with. So please take them with a pinch of salt that they are one person's views from lots of seeing things, but not from the organisation. And I think it's quite important that I say that, because we do need strong evidence to be able to argue for spending money or resource in one way or another. We need to know what works in order to argue to our partners that it is worth them spending their money on. Some of the things that we test don't work and would be a waste of resources, or they backfire and they would cause harm. And therefore, I think it's really, really, really important for us to test to ensure that we're not doing either of those things. Spending time on the basics, making sure that you do your planning, you get everything planned out before you launch your experiment or your other research, allows you to evaluate it properly. And I sometimes get criticized for not running perfect experiments. So I don't run lab-based experiments in the public sector. I would rather run the best test we can of something that can actually be implemented than run a perfect test of something that can never come true. Because in my experience, I've seen lots of things tested that then just disappear and fizzle out. And it doesn't matter what evidence you've got if they won't actually do it. If we can go to the next one. In which case, I will skip ahead if I've got one minute. So those are other ones. And if we go ahead to the life cycle then. So the life cycle starts with an idea coming in, and it works on a similar process to stage gates in project management. So at each stage, all of the orange boxes, there's a review of whether it is worth going further. So is the idea worth scoping? If it is worth scoping, we should gather the evidence that's already there, because it might be that we should just implement it without further testing. It might be that actually people have tested this lots of times and it's not worth doing in this way. Gate one, is it worthwhile? Is it worthwhile putting testing into the business capabilities? So what capacity have we got to do it? What are our baselines? What are our cohorts? And what would our research requirements be? At gate two, we're then saying it's feasible. It's feasible to run this in the public sector live. And we would then develop a full research plan, which then goes through our ethics board. At that point, we have a research-ready product at gate three, which we then go and get funding, because we know what we're going to do, we know what it's going to cost, and we know where we're going to run it. We then run our experiment and analyze it true to the things that we set before we started. So we set our research outcomes, we say what we're going to evaluate, and we evaluate it exactly as we said we would afterwards, allowing us to have this, rather than a run of trying to do all of this once we get funding, we can front load it and have a number of ideas at different gates as we go, working towards getting funding. That then allows us to put some money, if we've run these as randomized controlled trials, which are not scary, and they are easy to run in the public sector, it allows us to say what the difference is between the group that got the treatment and the group that didn't. And we have another project in the background running on called Thames Valley Together, where we will have costings from our social services partners and from police in relation to how much each task costs. We can then not only say what the government figures for the overall value for the economy are, we can also say exactly how much money is spent on each of these things already, on each of these young people that would go through the project. And I think a little bit rushed, but I think we got there in the end. So I think that's good to go. Thank you very much. That one is just how it would fit into the business as a whole, but it's nothing too interesting.
Thank you so much, Tori. This is fascinating. Like spelling out the process is always very, very helpful, I think, to guide us through. And we will share the slides. So if you were taking frantic notes, stop. You will have Tori's slides available at the end of the session. I'll hold my question. I'll put in the chat. Please add questions in the chat. We'll come to them at the end. I now would like to pass the microphone, if we can, to Cassandra Gardner. I know we had a little problem with your audio. Can we check if it's working now?
Is it working?
It is.
Relief. I had to change browser. It wouldn't work on Edge and it works on Chrome. So just for future reference.
So we know. Thank you. So welcome, Cassandra. Cassandra works in the London Borough of Redbridge, which for those who don't know London is on the northeast of London. And she has been working with, she's been looking for different value for money tools and played a little bit with the one we developed with CIPFA in the past. And we are really looking forward to hear your experience while you were looking for this, what you found that worked or didn't work. Cassandra, 10 minutes.
Thanks, Mara. Yeah, so I've got a couple of slides, but if we bring them up when we start talking about the strengths and weaknesses. So to just introduce where I'm coming from. So I run a number of programs. They're all digital programs that deal with change in the council. So they're big programs. They tend to be sort of a 3 to 4 year horizon, and the programs tend to last anything from 18 months to a year. And typically there's a budget of about £1 million around each program. Sorry, I'm just going to exit my phone. There we go. I had the phone on as well, just in case the laptop didn't work, so just cut that off. So we were asked by the finance director to look at the return on investment, and we generally generate a business case anyway, which gets presented to the corporate directors, which is part of our public-facing cabinet reports to validate how we're going to invest capital investment money, because these are capital projects. The task that the finance director asked me was to go deeper into return on investment, because the typical programs I was looking at the time were the children's and families and adult social care programs. What I wanted was a model that didn't just look at return on investment from a financial perspective, but also gave us some kind of values around the actual development of the service, which is what the point of a lot of our work is. It's not just can we strip down the service to a lower cost, it's actually how do we improve the service. And so I was looking for something that had credibility, which most councils, I believe all councils, and Jeffrey can correct me at the end, are regulated by CIPFA. So the fact that it's a CIPFA model, that was brilliant. And also with the government labs at Oxford University, another trusted brand. So came across the model and thought, right, we will try this. And that's why we wanted to use this model, because we wanted something a little bit more advanced, but also looked at things that actually this model uses the 4 E's, and that really appealed to some of our corporate directors. So looking at this point about the corporate directors, we have a 4-year mandate. It's very typical for councils. It aligns very much with like policy, and in that we have a corporate plan with all the equity in it, and in those equity points, this model allows us to actually sort of pull some of that equity in the corporate plan into the model, and then we can actually see what the investment gives a return on. So that was the sort of starting point for me, and that's why we decided to use the model. So if we've got the couple of slides I've got, rather than talk conceptually about the model, I just want to give you some samples from the actual model itself, because it is a complex model. As you can see across the bottom, there's about 5 different tabs. So you've got different sections and different areas where you're putting in qualitative and quantitative data. You're also starting to pull up sort of the value of that data. You're scoring it on a range of 1 to 4. You're also putting some information in here that we can tell where we've extracted the data from, what the type of data is, and therefore anybody who wants to look at the model can go through each page against the 4 E's, your economy, effectiveness, efficiency, and equity, I believe, and start to actually sort of see where the figures are coming from and what the data is telling us. On the last sheet, you'll see at the bottom tab there, you've got a summary, which kind of brings up, sorry, I've only got 2 slides, that actually calculates the type of information and gives a summary sheet to any corporate director who wants to look at that. So the strengths of the model is, like I said, it splits out the 4 areas. It's really useful because it gives us an efficiency saving, which I think we calculated it against 2 programs, was in the ballpark of 170k, I think. But the other things I really liked was the effectiveness. So it tells us about the return on investment of investing money into that service, and it gives us a figure that actually says the improvement to the service will increase by this value. And that was useful. Also measuring it against equity, against our corporate plan, we can actually say whether there's a good fit. So I think most of our programs came out at 60% or above around the alignment to the corporate plan. So we're demonstrating we're meeting the mandates that we've put out publicly as a council, local authority. And then the other thing, the effectiveness, it gives you, again, another figure about how effective the investment is. And so you've got 4 different levels, or whether you want to say microscopes or viewpoints of looking at this model, which I think is really useful. And particularly, like I said, when we're looking at services where in the public sector, we're not looking at financial returns, we're looking at developing services, because our model is not private sector where you're looking at improving your revenue streams or your private investment into a profit. We look at developing services that meet the requirements of the statutory requirements, but also improving services for our residents or people who are invested in the service. So there's lots of factors that we're trying to exemplify through these types of models. Now, if we want to move on to the next slide. So the feedback we got from the model with corporate directors was around the complexity of the model. They were slightly hands-off about it being complex. Now, I don't think that that was really an issue. I think that the more you would use a model like this, you would get more used to the complexity and understanding what data would needs to be gathered. But the issue for me was around the data. Now on this slide, you can see we've got, I think I've got B 1.1. You can see we've got 2, 4, I think 6 points of data in there. But on B2, I've only got one set of data. Now, for me, because I did some mathematics at Southampton Uni, I'm always concerned about what is the data actually doing. So my modelling is, if I've got 6 sets of data in one section and only one set of data in another, am I skewing my standard deviations, and am I sort of skewing the data? And that was points that I fed back to Matthias around, you know, how much data do I need to put in this model to make sure it's accurate? Is it 3 sets of data in each section? Is it 6 sets of data? And those were the sorts of things, like, we were limited by the amount of data we can get. And I think as most organizations are going through this whole data lakes, data forests, data gathering, data harvesting, our data will get better. But I want to sort of feel confident that the model is still effective if I'm only putting in one piece of data. And that was slightly where I was a bit concerned about. Am I actually, yeah, reinforcing the information to my corporate directors that the model stands up? I think, yeah, so hopefully from the slide, the point of putting the slide in there is so I'm not talking too conceptually, and people can actually start to see where some of the concerns for me pushing this model out and actually demonstrating it to the organization at a senior level was slightly kind of, oh, these bits and pieces. I think would I use the tool again? The other gap for me is the number of councils who are using tools like this. Now, in the council space, I attend a number of groups. I'm a senior member at Lottie and some other Tech UK. We speak out a lot. And we know that councils are keen to demonstrate how they're using financial tools and return on investment on particularly capital investment or new money going into big programs. There's talk about using total cost models. There's this model, which I didn't feel it's got a lot of visibility. So for us, it was very hard to benchmark against, well, if it's telling us what our organisation's doing, how good is that against other organisations? And there is a need to have some sort of benchmarking, because we can sort of, you know, I can stroke my own back and sort of say, brilliant, I'm absolutely top on this. But really, you need the context of what the model is telling other councils to sort of gauge against how well is this council investing its money and getting a return on investment. So I think that was something else that I felt like, even in councils, local authority, we're very well connected, and we'll often reach out to another council and just sort of say, hey, is anyone doing this, or are you doing this? And then we'll have some conversations about it. And so niggle points such as going back to things like, I've put this data in there, what data have you used? Because some of the things we transitioned was we had to change some of the cells to actually match the data that we had available. So we changed up that, and then we had to change the maths in the spreadsheet just to make sure that the calculations were accurate. But are there other types of data that people are using in their models that we could, yeah, we've got that data, we could plug that data in. And I think having some sort of, even if it's a checklist of data within our own organisation and other councils, it's really useful, because if we know what we can swap in that still makes the model work, and we happen to have that data, that means that we've got data rather than a blank space, which means your data is slightly loaded. Yeah, I think those are the main salient points I would do. I would definitely use it again. I think as a council where we have a need to sort of show some of the softer skills and the nuances, models like this are really useful, because it's not just about the cash flow. It's about sort of unpicking it, like the impact of investing in your own service and what that return means, particularly when we're like looking at limiting resources. And if we're investing in technology, it will tell us actually kind of you're spending this amount of money and that will improve the service by this value per year. And that can be really good, those sort of longer horizons. So Mara, hopefully, I hope I haven't spoken too quickly, and I hope I've sort of like got the gist of how we found the model across to you.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. I think this is extremely valuable, and especially the importance of benchmarking. Maybe Jeff can come back on this based on the experience from CIPFA and benchmarking across different councils. I invite again everybody to put the questions in the chat, and I'll invite our next speaker, who is Alex Hurrell, who is the head of evaluation at Counterpublic UK at the moment, but he has under his belt more than 15 years of experience working at the Oxford policy management team, doing a lot of value for money evaluation, and he can talk to us about his experience on which approach to pick when. Over to you, like everybody else, 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks, Maura. So I've been involved, as Maura mentions, in developing and applying a holistic approach to evaluating value for money, which we've found to be both rigorous and practical. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done and why we did it, and give some summary of our experience with this approach to value for money assessment. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thanks. So the background to this is, as Maura mentioned, I previously worked at an organization called Oxford Policy Management. I was leading the monitoring and evaluation team. And it was probably around 2015, around that period, there was increasing pressure from our clients, who were mainly international development agencies, so funders of programs, who were under increasing pressure to report on and evaluate value for money, and with particular reference to accountability to their domestic taxpayers who funded these interventions which were going on overseas. So big pressure on VFM. However, we found that too often this felt like a tick box exercise, yeah, and it focused on the economy and efficiency side, very much on the money end rather than the value end. And this wasn't satisfactory for us. It wasn't really satisfactory for our clients. And another aspect was it often duplicated with parallel internal M&E or MEL functions or independent evaluation initiatives that would go alongside this. So we started working with someone called Julian King, who's there's a link here to his website. I've got contacts at the end. On a couple of specific projects, and the appeal of working with Julian is that he'd come from an economic evaluation background, but was also a very experienced evaluator, and he was involved in some cutting edge thinking about bringing this together in terms of a more holistic approach to assessing value for money. And after some good experience on a couple of specific projects, we decided to roll this out across all our projects, and we developed what we called the OPM approach to assessing value for money. The cover is on this slide here. This was done, published in 2018. There's an updated version coming out later this year, so watch this space. This paper actually is referenced in the CIPFA VfM toolkit guidance note. So the guidance note that goes alongside the toolkit that the previous speaker talked about. And from our assessment, it actually looks very complementary to the toolkit, but I'm sure there's work that can be done there to think about how that could work together even more so. Next slide, please. The approach, as I mentioned, was developed through Julian's doctoral research. We tested it in case studies, providing proof of concept. We refined it in multiple sectors and settings. Some of the sectors are listed down the right-hand side of this slide. And it's now been used globally to evaluate complex and hard to measure policies, programs, and interventions. It has won awards from the UK Evaluation Society and the Australian Evaluation Society in recognition of its innovative nature and crucially, its widespread applicability. Next slide, please. The key point is that this isn't just another method. We already have the methods and tools. What we needed was a system, an approach to help us align the existing methods to answer VFM questions. So in order to achieve clear answers to VFM questions, we didn't need new methods. What we added was a sense-making framework for defining VFM in the context of that specific program or intervention, aligning that assessment with the program's design, selecting the right mix of methods that would produce the required evidence to answer the relevant VFM questions for that context, and then an approach for being able to make robust judgments and robust assessments of the answers to those VFM questions on a transparent and agreed basis. Yeah. Next slide, please. So our approach is, I mean, I can't go, I'm not going to give it, I would encourage people to go and look at the even though it's new version coming out, but still go to the 2018 version for the full details. But just to give us kind of snapshot overview of the approach, and some of the key features, it's interdisciplinary. Value for money means good use of resources to create value. It's a shared domain of economics and evaluation, so it requires an interdisciplinary approach by definition. Our approach is holds at its center the need for a sound evaluative reasoning. VFM assessment is evaluation. It requires transparent approach to make judgments from evidence. We recommend the use of evaluation rubrics for doing this, and again, there's more detail of how to do that in the guide. The other feature of the approach is it's participatory. So VFM is a matter of context, perspectives, and trade-offs. Value comes from the people involved in that initiative, and therefore value for money evaluation needs to be inclusive and participatory to properly capture all the various dimensions of value that matter in that particular context. And it's mixed methods in focus. So and this is crucial because value for money includes intangible values, right? And some of the most valuable impacts and resources are going to be the hardest to measure in many cases. There'll be multiple types and sources of evidence that are needed, therefore, and so we're always using mixed methods to make our assessment. Next slide, please. The approach follows a logical sequence of 8 steps, which helps to make VFM assessment intuitive to learn and practical to use. We have found that people with almost no prior training or experience can rapidly learn how to conduct sound VFM assessments following these steps. In terms of the, I'd like to, again, I can't go into the full detail, but draw attention to a couple of things. So the gray box in the middle mentions economic methods. So these are crucial. Now, but the point here is that we will always include economic methods, so cost benefit analysis, for example, where it's feasible and appropriate. So often our VFM assessments were part of very large multi-million-pound, multi-year evaluations of large-scale programs, and in that case there was a comprehensive economic evaluation component to that, and that would obviously be pulled in as a key aspect of the analysis and the evidence. However, there will be other types of interventions where it's just not feasible to have fully developed and implemented economic evaluation, and therefore we can tailor this to the specific context and use the evidence and analysis approaches that are available and appropriate. The other aspect I want to draw attention to is around the steps 2 and 3, and what we mean here by criteria are really the things that matter. So very often we've used the 4 E's or the 5 E's, and then the distinction between that and standards. And standards are, what does good look like for each of those 5 E's? So a key feature is that we define that up front and in advance. Okay. Next slide, please. So thank you. That's it from me. Just to note that all of this is open source. All the information is available through the OPM guide or Julian's website, and we are very happy to offer support to assist in its adoption and adaptation to different contexts. Our contact details are here. If you're coming more from a UK domestic point of view, then best to contact me at Kantar Public. I lead the team that works on program evaluation of UK government programs and other public bodies in the UK. If it's more an international development angle that you're coming from, then best to go to Oxford Policy Management. We also run an online training course via the UK Evaluation Society, which goes over 2 half days, and I think the next session is in early June. So thank you from me, and very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Alex. I find it fascinating to see how the focus is creating steps in the process rather than inventing a new tool to make it like digestible, and how can you embed it in your decision-making process. I'm coming to Ian now, our fourth and last speaker, who joins us from Oslo. Ian is the Chief Data Scientist at the office of the Audit Office in Norway, the equivalent of the National Audit Office in the UK. And we asked him to bring us a outsider perspective. All our speakers were from the UK, and there is a risk that we are inward looking, but the work of defining value for money is a global work, like our audience. And we're very happy to have you here, Ian, and I'll give you the floor to you for 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mara. I'm very happy to be here. So the title of my presentation is Value for Money Assessments, a Performance Audit View. And as Mara said, I am the Chief Data Scientist at the so-called Innovation Lab at our Office of the Auditor General of Norway. And I've also been involved in the standard setting on an international level regarding performance audit. So next slide, please. Yeah, first, a few words about performance audit and value for money, because first, when I got this invitation, I kind of didn't quite grasp the thing behind it, because if you read the National Audit Office reports on what they call money for or value for money audits, that is basically the same as performance audit. So value for money assessment, performance audit, it's kind of the same thing. But then, of course, I realized that in this context, value for money assessments is kind of an ex ante kind of evaluation, while performance audit is naturally ex post. And of course, auditors have kind of a benefit as we come in after something has happened. So we normally, at least, have data on what actually has happened. Just a quick reference to what Tori talked about, because we might also have a problem with this, because if a program or measure is not set up as an experiment at the outset, we won't have a kind of a we won't have data on treatment and control group, for example. So we have kind of have to use the data that is available for the things that actually happened. So next slide, please. So I think performance audits, and also as Alex kind of indicated, performance audits is very close, in my view, to evaluations. And performance audits can be done in numerous ways, and it can address both economy, efficiency, effectiveness, equity also, all at the same time, or you can focus on one of these kind of aspects. So often when doing performance audits, if you look around the globe at national audit offices, supreme audit institutions, a lot of performance auditing is kind of done. Yeah, you kind of do something else than kind of a value for money assessment in the form of a cost benefit analysis, because at least in Norway, when we do assessments before something is going to be implemented, we normally do it in a more economic sense as a cost benefit analysis, when you have kind of a cost and you will have, and there are some benefits that you want to achieve. So what is the relation between the cost and the benefit, and if that's positive, fine, then we might have a program. Next slide, please. So just some examples on possible audit designs, and these are just examples. You may, of course, do case studies on some case problem that has been implemented. You could do process studies on the process of implementing a program, for example. You could do productivity analysis, which is more of a kind of a limited input-output analysis, for example, in the form of what's called the data envelopment analysis. You could do time series analysis, of course, if you had that kind of data. You may do more qualitative in-depth studies. You can also, of course, do cost benefit after the fact. And you could do more experimental, pure econometric analysis, for example, stuff like regression discontinuity, if you have situations where you might have some kind of natural experiment. And basically, so all design types used in social science evaluation trade can be relevant when doing performance audit, and also value for money audit in the National Audit Office sense, I believe. Yeah, please, next. So this thing about cause and effect, and this is also kind of interesting, I hope, regarding what Tori said. If you want to do real cause and effect studies, you kind of need to set something up like an experiment, or you need some kind of data on treatment group, on control group, on this idea about everything else equal. So econometricists are kind of at least sometimes accused of doing what's called the lamppost methodology. They tend to do studies, research where there is data to do that kind of analysis. Nothing wrong with that, because there's a tremendous amount of very interesting econometric analysis. And this book on from Joshua Angrist and Pischke. Angrist is a Nobel laureate in economics, by the way. It's a very, very good book, and gives a brilliant insight into how to do these kind of econometric studies. But there are these kind of analyses are difficult to do properly if they are not set up as such at the outset, because normally you don't have data on outcome. When planning a program, planning a measure, you of course you don't have data on outcome. So how do you get that kind of data? How do you get data on counterfactuals, for example? So I'm just asking the question. So next, please. So ex ante assessments, you cannot do obviously a case study of a case that doesn't yet exist. So an ex ante assessment might at least sometimes boil down to some kind of cost benefit estimation, which often is very valuable and often, of course, totally necessary to do. So by all means, but also, by the way, and this is kind of something that I sometimes miss in analysis regarding cost benefit and ex ante assessments. What about opportunity cost? If you spend if you're planning on spending money on something, some measure, some program, what opportunities are kind of missed? And should there be some kind of thinking around opportunity cost? I tend to miss that part in some assessments. I think that might be something that people doing these kind of assessments could think a little bit more about, probably. At least that is my kind of personal view. Next, please. So again, cost benefit estimation, fine and necessary, but obviously it can be done in different ways. And the GO Lab toolkit is one way, very valuable, asks a lot of important questions that should be asked and should be answered. But in other contexts, there might sometimes be better to do something a little bit more simple, perhaps. And it depends also on the amount of money you have on doing the assessment. So in some contexts, there might be an idea to do something simple, then try to do something comprehensive and possibly fail. Next, please. Because context is important. For example, if you are planning on building a road, pricing the transport time saved is quite easy because you can set a monetary price on those kind of savings. But for example, if you're talking about a program where the point is to getting ex-convicts employed, what is kind of the value of this? How do you measure the value of this? Also in monetary terms. It might be difficult to do that kind of measurements and costing or valuation, really. So also numbers can seem deceptively true, because at least and I am a sociologist. So if you, I sometimes think that if you set a price on something, it becomes something real, something almost true, because you are able to put the price on it. But the price may of course be totally wrong. So there is something about numbers, prices, that kind of seems to be objective in a way, and that might not always be the case. Next, please. So cost benefit is also, I believe, weak on analysis of preconditions for cost actually leading to benefit. You might have some evaluation about cost, and you may have some ideas about benefit, but what needs to be in place to get this benefit? For example, will incentivization through contracts actually work? We kind of tend to assume that, but is it really true in a way? Just asking the question. So next and final slide, I believe. And here I totally agree with Tore, and just a thought from me. Can a new program be implemented as an experiment in collaboration with researchers? I think probably more could do. This is very unusual to do in Norway, but I think there are a number of countries around the world that perhaps the government and government agencies could do a little bit more of this kind of experiments. When introducing a program, you can set it up as an experiment. So yeah, that was all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian, for this reflection. And one of the things I noticed, I trained as an economist and decision analyst, is the power of numbers. I agree with you. Once you put a number, especially if it's a precise number with each decimal point, people have an impression that it must be right. So thank you for your comments. I'll pass the microphone to my co-chair, Jeff, to lead the Q&A session.
Thanks, Maura. And thank you to our 4 panelists who hopefully provided everyone a nice range of perspectives on assessing public policies and how they're funded and which ones actually get funded and implemented. We've heard from 2 practitioners in local government. Then we've heard from Alex, who kind of applies this framework across a range of projects and programs, and then from Jan, from a watchdog sort of perspective, looking at it. And I think that's very important that we make those connections, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that there are practical tools for practitioners to be using, but that also we connect it, that we bridge it into a more formalized process so that it can be integrated into things like the performance audit function as well. So in terms of questions, now it's the Q&A session. I see that there have been a few questions posted in the chat, and so please feel free to continue posting things. One of the questions is around resourcing. That's a very big issue, particularly for smaller and less well-resourced councils and other public sector bodies. And the question is, how do you overcome that hurdle when you feel that all the resources that you have available to you are already stretched, that there is nothing extra? How do you make space to then say, aha, well, let's try using something like this VFM toolkit to provide a more objective lens to evaluating projects that, in particular, that are more innovative and that don't have a precedent. But when you don't have that wiggle room of staff or expertise, how do you go about doing that? And so I'd like to pose that question first to maybe Tori and then to Cassandra. Tori, in your organization, you talked about sort of system change and that whole system approach, and how you have this VFM life cycle through which the violence reduction unit, anything that's being commissioned through that unit needs to kind of go through the screening process. So how do you go about addressing capacity and limited resourcing and encouraging organizations within your organization or subgroups within your organization to kind of take the time to do this type of assessment?
Thank you. I think the most important thing has been that they know they will be supported by us doing the bits that they think are impossible or hard. So the actual running of a randomized controlled trial, for example, we started one in focused deterrence. The hardest conversation was getting them to have the courage to go with us on sort of something that they didn't really understand to start with. And once we got down to the fact that they actually didn't know whether the thing they wanted to test would work, whether it would backfire, or whether it would just do nothing, and everyone in the room wanted to do good. A few of them then stepped back and said, well, oh, we'd have just implemented this and just done it, and then we'd have never known what happened. And we'd have then carried on doing something that might have been wasting time for a long, long period. So actually taking the time to get them to slow down, just take a pause and work out what is important to them and what isn't, where they think it might realistically make a difference and where it might not, and then giving them the support of pretty much I pick up the evaluative work for them. So that's our offer for them, is if they join us in this process, we will make sure they don't have to do any of the numbers. They don't have to do any of that side of it. But I do expect that they plan it with me to start with, and that they feed back to me about the tracking of the experiment as it goes along, because I need to know that they treated the treatment group and not the control group the whole way through. We've also designed randomization tools for them and other things so that they don't have to pick up any of those complicated bits. I think we're on resources that we're finding that we need. I get quite stretched thin by paperwork. So we're going to be taking on a project support officer at some point soon to pick up some of that liaison in relation to multiple experiments at once. Because I think we're currently running 4 and we've got another 6 or 8 in the pipeline to run. And that's going to be quite intense to run all at once. We've got quite a big geographical area, and there's not a huge amount of people that are behind it. But I hope that sort of also gives a little bit of confidence that actually anybody can do this. If you set your sights on running it in a really well-organized manner, and you don't apply for stupid funding that comes in at the last minute and the biggest problem we found is, oh, but they said they'd give us £50,000 to do this thing. And you step back and you work out that actually to do it properly would either cost £5,000 or £500,000. And they actually didn't work that out beforehand. And then they have to write a report saying how they nearly got somewhere that they could have done something important. And people are getting quite excited about not having to do those kind of reports anymore, which means they're actually willing to free up their own resources to help us, because we're telling them not to waste their time. And I think that's gone down really well.
Thanks for that, Tori. Cassandra, coming to you, you've used at Redbridge the toolkit, our toolkit, to assess, I think, about 5 of your projects. Does it get easier on successive iterations? Was it effective in influencing the thinking of your corporate directors in terms of getting funding for projects that hadn't been done before and didn't really have a precedent? And would you continue using it for people in the audience who are thinking, was it worth the effort? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it is a good question around resources, because we all have limited resources. I'm lucky. I've got a team, so it was my team working on this. So I've got project support, I've got program managers, program leads, and I've got BAs, business analysts. And then we also obviously linked up with our finance partners, the BPs, finance business partners, to cross-reference the data. So the journey we went on, and maybe this is better if I just tell you the practical side of what we did, Jeffrey, is first of all, I actually turned up at Oxford University and met Jeffrey and Matthias, well, Matthias's predecessor, to actually understand the model, because you put on a very good conference. I could see what the model was, so I'm starting to already gather, what are we looking at here? What's the context of information that I'm trying to present? And that cuts down an awful lot of kind of brain thinking if you kind of understand where you're coming at with the model. So then it's coming back into the organization. We've already got a we already have a business case, and so a lot of data we're starting to capture, because I think anyone who's working on trying to get money, you have to have a business case, you have to have some sort of figures and comprehension around what this business will do. So we already had some figures in there, and it was a question of extracting them and plugging them in. Now, where it came interesting was for our business partners, our financial business partners, to cross-reference whether they were satisfied with the actual calculations we were using in the modelling. So I think from a sort of a resourcing point of view, what was really useful was it cross-referenced our business cases and it stacked up, and that really means a lot of time is minimized at the very start of a project before a project launches. And as I've said, these are anything between 6 months to 18-month projects that we really don't want to get wrong. So if you're talking resourcing, to me, getting it right at the very beginning means you're going to minimize your overheads and your resources going forward in that program. So if you're looking at it from that context of cross-referencing all the information and the data and running it through this model compared to our business case, and they aligned, and that was a really interesting piece of work. And then the other kind of discipline that this created, and I know the word rigor's been used, and that is a good word, was the people involved in the modelling really started to understand what they were trying to achieve in the project. And so by looking at sort of things like what's the positive outcomes of this, what percentage of value does this model create for us, they had to go several layers deeper to get that data and to plug it into the model. And that, again, to me, minimizes the waste of resources, because you're getting very focused on what's this going to actually give us and tell us and what we're doing here. So there was a lot more value in actually going through the exercise. On a really basic level, it really engages the brain cells. It really does make you have to think, and I think that is really useful. So I know somebody mentioned a bit of a tick box. I did not find it a tick box exercise at all. We had to have quite a few sessions where we went through, what are we talking about here? What data can we actually put into the model to gather the right context and the right outputs from the model? So it really galvanizes people when you use a model like this around the program at those early days. And so from a resourcing perspective, yes, you need to pull resources in, but I don't think they're not resources you won't have. I mean, I didn't create a new team. I didn't bring anybody new into this program. I used the resources I had, and we had the data. It's just sort of pushing people a little bit further to use a model like this to sort of really galvanize what we're talking about.
Thanks for that. That's encouraging, I'm sure, for listeners who are thinking of starting to use a tool like this. I'm just mindful of time, and I just want to ask two very quick questions to Jan and to Alex, but I'll try to squeeze it in 5 minutes. And so apologies for anyone who has to drop off, because I realize it's 2 o'clock now. But Alex, in terms of data availability, that's one of the constraints that a lot of practitioners face. You know, where is the data? If we've never done this thing before, where can I find data that is accurate, that others will consider to be acceptable? How do you go about balancing the need for accuracy with the limitations that are inherent in doing something like VFM? And for Jan, what is the role for organizations, departments that sort of that can't do a full-blown business case assessment, something like, you know, the UK Green Book, for example, and all they can do is something more piecemeal and limited, like using something like this VFM toolkit? Is it up to scratch in terms of you know, assurance that people are using data that is, you know, good data, that's accurate data? How do you go about assessing, making that type of decision as to the role of VFM? So first, if you could, I'll give it to Alex and then to Jan, please.
Great, thank you. So I think you can come at this from two sides. or at least we have. So you've got VFM assessments that are coming from as part of an evaluation, like an independent evaluation. These vary in scale, but often are relatively well resourced in a range of contexts around the world. And so you've got all the evidence that you're gathering, whether that's secondary evidence or primary data collection, to answer your evaluation questions. And just by bringing up front the VFM questions as part of that, you can ensure that you're designing your evaluation to gather the necessary evidence that you need to come up with the judgment. So there was a question about sense-making framework. What that really is doing is just saying, so what? Okay, so a CBA. So you're saying what matters, and in many cases that's the 4 E's or the 5 E's. And so what does good look like on that? And then what data do you need to make an assessment around whether good's been achieved or excellent, etc. So that's a kind of, you're in a luxury. So when you're coming from an evaluation point of view, you've often got the luxury of quite scope for gathering together quite a lot of data and evidence and doing something quite comprehensive. The other angle that we've come at this is where you're more on the probably closer to, say, Redbridge. You know, you're an implementing agency. You're delivering stuff, or you're a standalone program delivering stuff, and you're being asked to report on the VFM of your activities or new activities, for example. And we've been in that position as well, and we've applied our approach in that case as well. And here it's really about doing the same exercise, like what matters in terms of VFM performance. Again, very often the 5 E's. So how is performance against that? What does good look like? What evidence do we need to assess as we go along and monitor? Are we hitting good performance under economy, good performance under efficiency, good performance under cost effectiveness, etc.? And then ideally, you would be, if you're managing any sort of program, collecting monitoring data on how, or any initiative, you're collecting information as a manager of that program on how it's being delivered. Similar to what Tori outlined about, you know, even in the trials, which is quite a specific pilot type setting, there needs to be that feedback of what's actually happening, right? And what's actually being delivered. So similarly on a sort of program, so from that internal monitoring perspective, you hopefully you've got activities on the ground, recording what's going on, how it's being delivered, and ideally what you can do is tweak them. Ideally, you don't have loads more. You don't want to, like Cassandra said, you're not going to employ more people or add more functions, but you really just fine tune the data collection that you're already doing in order to inform the so what questions that you're really interested in. So if there's one takeaway in the whole approach, it's about bringing that so what question up front, being really clear around what good VFM performance looks like, and then making sure that whatever resource you've got is tailored to that, so you're not wasting anything. You're getting good VFM in your assessment of VFM. Sorry, I've gone on quite long there, but it was a deceptively difficult question.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Jan, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, just a few last comments from me. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that, while on a national level, you also have these politicians of certain color who wants to kind of get things decided, whatever the cost benefit might be. So that's of course something for audit offices to consider, these politicians. So that's one thing. But also value for money assessment, of course, it's should be done almost regarding any new program, of course. And you might have very huge public programs that kind of needs a certain kind of setup regarding assessment. And you might also have at least in Norway, you might have very small municipalities with very limited resources, also regarding competence and knowledge and the skills they have. Then those kind of municipalities might perhaps need very simple tools to work with. But that said, I think that the VFM toolkit of GO Lab, it kind of fits some kind in the middle. So it should kind of might embrace quite a lot of possible possible programs and measures that that some council wants to implement. So so I think that's a case. Yeah, but of course, being an auditor in a national audit office, there are a lot of programs that are being decided by Parliament, whatever the cost benefit might be. And regarding also the size of the assessment as such, all VFM assessments should also give or the benefit should be greater than the cost. So so I think it has to be kind of fit to the size of the program also. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of our speakers and all of you for joining us today. We had Cassandra Gardiner from Redbridge Council, Tori Olfin from Thames Valley Police, Alex Harrell from Kantar, and Jan Beckstrom from the Norway Audit Office. And hopefully all of you have will find this motivation to carry on this conversation around VFM, both with us here at CIPFA and the GO Lab, but equally amongst yourselves, as this is a community peer learning group. We will be summarizing the meeting and the discussion today and posting a recording of it, and that will be sometime next week. But thank you very much and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, bye.